year he builds the temple. And so that gives a little bit of background. And then we talked about, we're going to be talking a lot about the temple tonight, maybe next week as well. And just as a background, the first real home that God ever built, a church as we would know it, tabernacle as they would know it, tent of meeting, was the one that he commanded Moses to make. And so this was for the 40 years in the wilderness. It was all broken down. Different tribes, different families were charged with carrying different parts of that structure as they moved around. And I said last week they moved 40 times in 40 years. So they broke that down, moved that, and the tents all around it for the 40 years. And then Solomon built the temple. David wanted to. You remember, he was charged. David asked to build the temple, and then Nathan the prophet said, "No, God's going to build a temple out of you, but your son will build me this temple." And so Solomon built the temple, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. After, in 586 BC, Solomon was around 1000 BC. Around 586, at 586 BC, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and tore it to the ground. They destroyed the whole city, tore the walls down. We find Ezra and Nehemiah building the temple again, rebuilding the wall again. But prior to that is when the Babylonians destroyed the temple. And so they built, Zerubbabel built another temple, one that was very inferior to Solomon's temple. And that temple stayed in place until King Herod, who was a builder, decided that he wanted to go on a building campaign and build a new temple. And so it was enormous, it was opulent. He had his Antonia fortress down at the bottom left corner there. That was where his garrison of soldiers were. So he knew how seditious, how contentious these Jews were. And he knew that the temple was the center of their fanaticism. So he wanted to have his men right next to it. So if something broke up, something seethed up, he'd be able to break it up. To give you some, there's another one of Herod's temple. Just beautiful. In Israel, this is actually a photograph. They have a replica of the city that is about the size of this room. 4 times the size of this room, with a wall all the way around it, like Jerusalem had a wall. And that temple is in that miniature city, and that's what they've taken the pictures of. You can see the other city behind it. It's incredible. When we go to Israel, we always tour that site. This is, again, another picture. That building on the right was called the Colonnade. That's where Jesus would have done a lot of his teaching. Those steps that you see there in the front right corner, those would have been the steps in the book of Acts where Paul was taken captive, where the Roman soldiers heaved him up on their shoulders to save him from the Jews who were trying to kill him. And then that bridge that you see there, that was the Red Heifer Bridge that came out of the Eastern Gate, went over to the Mount of Olives, and for the Red Heifer, which was don't have time to do that story, but that is just a fascinating story. And these are the temple comparisons. If you see the court of the tabernacle would have been that size. So the first picture we showed you, the very first picture out in the wilderness, that would have been the court of the tabernacle. That would have been the size of that. Then Solomon's temple would be the box in red. And then Herod's temple is the box in blue, which dwarfed it. But the box to the left is going to be Ezekiel's temple, which is hugest, bigger than any of them. So large. So that's when you're going to get to see. That's when you're going to get to hang out in, as we studied in Ezekiel. And so this was Solomon's temple. This is what we're going to be looking at. The entrance, the holy place is the larger room, and then the most holy place is the room behind that, where the Ark of the Covenant were kept. We're going to be looking at these other items maybe tonight. We said this is one of the stones, and these stones are huge. The largest stone, well, how far back does that go? It was big. I think it was 75 feet. Does that sound right? 75 feet long. Yeah, I'm sorry. Very, very big. Well, maybe I'm sorry. Yeah, 45 feet long, 11 and a half feet tall, 570 tons, which is 1.1 million pounds. One stone. And they moved those things from quarries. So let's pick up 1 Kings 6:2. We'll read about this. So you get the dimensions here again. 1 Kings 6, verse 2. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The foyer at the front of the temple was 30 feet wide, running along the entire width of the temple. It projected outward 15 feet from the front of the temple. Solomon also made narrow recessed windows in the temple. Let me get back to these pictures. So this would be the side rooms there you can see. Verse 5, which is really where we pick up tonight. It says, a complex of rooms was built against the outer wall. You can see that. It's a cutaway, but you can see the outer rooms there. A complex of rooms was built along the outer walls of the temple, all the way around the sides and rear of the building. The complex was 3 stories high, the bottom floor being 7.5 feet wide. Looks about right. The second floor, 9 feet wide. The top floor, 10.5 feet wide. The rooms were connected to the walls of the temple by beams resting on ledges built out from the wall. So the beams were not inserted into the walls themselves. Verse 7, the stones used in the construction of the temple were pre-finished at the quarry, so the entire structure was built without the sound of a hammer or any other iron tool at the building site. So these huge stones, as we saw there, were all quarried at cut, finished. There were no hammers, no chisels. So, there was no adjustment. When the stones came, they were perfect. They were perfect. And as I said, they still don't know how they did this. There's another picture of the stone. That's, when we go to Jerusalem, that's on the inside of the wall. It's called the Rabbi's Tunnel. And if on the other side of that wall where she's standing, is where the Jews, the Wailing Wall is. If you picture all the Jews praying to the wall on the outside, she's on the inside of that wall, under the Temple Mount. And you can walk that today. It must be, 2 football fields long, maybe 3. And you can see all those stones perfectly matched. This is one of the places where they believe they quarried them from. We'll show you some more pictures of that. There you can see they would have, for different needs, they would have notched those out to put beams in, but maybe to move them. And down below, you can see just the exactness of these cuts. And as I said, when these stones, like this one 45 feet long, you can't get a piece of paper between the cracks. That's how precise they're cut. Now, how did you do that? This is supposedly by way of this worm. So let me read this article. This is, again, this is, I'll say mythology, but you listen to this. This is in the Legend of the Jews. This is in Josephus' writings. But I don't, this is pretty incredible. So I don't hold to this, but it is interesting, all right? The book of Kings contains a precise description of the building of the first temple. Its dimensions, the cedar and cypress beams that covered the walls, the gilded ornaments and carvings, and the two cherubim that stood wing to wing above the Ark of the Covenant. We'll talk about that later. It also included this puzzling verse. And the house, when it was in building, was built of stone finished at the quarry, and there was neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron heard in the house while it was in building. How could it be that no hammers, chisels, or iron ore tools were used to carve the stones of the temple, while the Bible also states that the stones were hewn? The Jewish sages offer a simple answer. They say the stones were prepared in another location and transported there to the construction site at the Temple Mount. We'll look at Solomon's quarries later. The book of Kings even brings support for this explanation. In 1 Kings 5:31 it says, quote, "And the king commanded, and they quarried great stones, heavy stones, to lay the foundation of the house with hewn stones." But our interest here is the alternative explanation appearing in rabbinic literature, according to which the stones were hewn with the help of something called a shamir. The obscure shamir appears in the Bible itself, though not in the book of Kings. In Ezekiel 3:9, it is written that shamir is stronger than flint. The Hebrew text of Jeremiah 17:1 also makes mention of shamir, though English versions have translated the word as flint or diamond. The sin of Judah is written with a pen of iron with a diamond shamir point, engraved on the tablet of their hearts and on the horns of your altar. These passages clearly suggest that shamir is a hard material of some kind. Now, the Talmud provides additional information about this mysterious shamir. For example, in the Evad, shamir is mentioned as one of the 10 things created on the Sabbath eve, before the completion of the act of creation. The substances created in that moment were somewhat enigmatic in nature, including the shamir, which had the power to cut stones. Sotath, chapter 48b, explains that the shamir was used to engrave the stones inserted into the priestly breastplate, which were cut like, quote, like a fig which splits open in the summer. It also says that because nothing could withstand the shamir's strength, it is stored in tufts of wool in a lead box filled with barley grain. The Talmud in Gittin 68a contains the most detailed legend surrounding the shamir. According to the story, King Solomon asked his advisors how the stones for the temple could be prepared without the use of an axe or chisel, as it was inappropriate, listen, as it was inappropriate to use tools of bloodshed and war to construct such a building. They told him, his advisors told him of the miraculous shamir, but did not know where to find it. The king then summoned forth spirits and demons, but these also were unable to say where it might be found. They did, however, suggest that Solomon would consult their lord, Asmodeus, the king of demons, who might know the answer. King Solomon sent his general, Benaiah, who subdued Asmodeus and brought him to the king's palace. Again, you can tell this is fable. Asmodeus revealed to Solomon that the shamir was in the possession of the Lord of the Sea, guarded by a certain bird, a woodcock, according to most English versions of the story. Solomon quickly sent off another of his servants, who prevailed over the woodcock and managed to steal the shamir away. From here, the story continues with further twists and turns. You can read a version of this in Louis Ginsburg's classic, The Legends of the Jews, and I will be reading from that a bit later. In Rashi's commentary of this legend, who was a rabbi, he deduced that the woodcock was in fact a hoopie, which became a popular fixture of the legends of King Solomon. But more to the point, he suggested that the shamir was not a stone or other inanimate object at all, as can be assumed from some of the versions of the legend, but was in fact a living creature, a worm. The source of Rashi's explanation is unclear, but the phrase shamir worm was born and even made it into the writings of Mendele Shaphorim, who lived 1836 to 1917, who mentions the shamir as one of the wondrous creatures that Benjamin III found in his travels. The religious commentators do not agree on whether the shamir was a living creature or a kind of stone with miraculous powers. On the other hand, based on the Talmud, they determined that after the temple was destroyed, the shamir was obliterated from the world. However, about 2 years ago, a team of researchers in the Philippines, listen to this closely. 2 years ago, a team of researchers in the Philippines discovered a worm capable of eating through limestone. While limestone is a relatively soft form of rock, nevertheless, the existence of a stone-carving worm might not be such an unrealistic notion after all. Just interesting. So again, legend, myth, but it is what the Jews teach, what they say. And then let me read from the legend of the Jews what this says. According to the measure of zeal displayed by Solomon, were the help and favor shown him by God. During the 7 years it took to build the temple, not a single workman died who was employed about it, and not even did a single one fall sick. And as the workers were sound and robust from first to last, so the perfection of their tools remained unimpaired, and the building stood complete. Thus the work suffered no sort of interruption. After the dedication of the temple, however, the workmen died off, lest they build similar structures for the heathen and for their gods. Their wages they were to receive from God in the world to come, and the master workman Hiram was rewarded by being permitted to reach paradise alive. So that's the reward they got for building the temple. The temple was finished in the month of Bul, but the edifice stood closed for nearly a whole year because it was the will of God that the dedication take place in the month of Abraham's birth. Okay, and then we're going to read about the throne of Solomon, which you'll find very interesting, I think. So that's the shamir, and do with it as you may. I'm not really a buyer of that, but it is in Jewish tradition, so you should be aware of what they say sometimes. Let's go into verse 8. It says, the entrance to the bottom floor was built on the south side of the temple. There were winding stairs going up to the second floor, and another flight of stairs between the second and third floors. After completing the temple structure, Solomon put a ceiling made of beams and planks of cedar. As already stated, there was a complex of rooms on the three sides of the buildings. Let's go back to that. There you go. Built three sides of the buildings, attached to the temple walls by cedar timbers. Each story of the complex was 7.5 feet high, so they were not real high ceilings. And so let's get here. This is Solomon's temple. Let me get the right picture here. Yeah, okay. Let's go into verse 11. Then the Lord gave this message to Solomon, concerning this temple you are building, if you keep all my laws and regulations and obey my commandments, I will fulfill through you the promise I made to your father David. I will live among the people of Israel and never forsake my people. And so as he's building, it says that you are building in the process. He says again, if you keep the commands, I will live among your people. And then going on to verse 14. So Solomon finished building the temple. The entire inside from floor to ceiling was paneled with wood. He paneled the walls and ceilings with cedar, and he used cypress for the floors. He partitioned off an inner sanctuary, the most holy place. Again, let's go back to this. The most holy place is in the very back, where you see the Ark of the Covenant, the angels. It says verse 16, he partitioned off an inner sanctuary, the most holy place, at the far end of the temple. It was 30 feet deep and was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. So as you picture this, picture all this being paneled with ceiling, all right? The whole inside is paneled with cedar. Now that's important because of what happens later. Verse 17, the main room of the temple outside the most holy place was 60 feet long. That's the holy place, where it says Solomon's temple in black letters. Underneath that is the holy place. Cedar paneling completely covered the stone walls throughout the temple, and the paneling was decorated with carvings of gourds and open flowers. And then verse 19, Solomon prepared the inner sanctuary of the rear of the temple where the Ark of the Lord's covenant would be placed. This inner sanctuary was 30 feet long, 30 feet wide, 30 feet high, a box, as you can see it is. Solomon overlaid its walls and ceiling with pure gold. He also overlaid the altar made of cedar. Verse 21, so this is the outer courtyard. You can see the altar burnt offerings, the laver where they washed the sacrificial items, and then the holy place, the table of shewbread, the menorah, the candle, the altar of incense, we talked about that Sunday, and then the veil separating. And then inside the Holy of Holies, that 30 by 30 by 30 box is the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy of Holies. It says then, verse 21, and he overlaid the rest of the temple's interior. Listen. He overlaid the rest of the temple's interior with gold, and he made gold chains to protect the entrance of the most holy place. So he finished overlaying the entire temple with gold, including the altar that belonged to the most holy place. So when you picture this in the future, everything was gold. Everything inside that holy place and most holy place was gold, plated in gold. And fabulous wealth. As we said, there was, a couple $1 billion worth of gold that David alone donated to building of this temple. And again, there's the Ark of the Covenant. It says then, verse 23, within the inner sanctuary, Solomon placed 2 cherubim made of olive wood, each 15 feet tall. Now let me get these pictures. So in the most holy place, you have the Ark of the Covenant, but on either side of the Ark of the Covenant were these huge angels. Their wingspan is 15 feet. So 15 feet, that's almost, take two chairs away, and that's probably 15 feet. That's probably fair. So that's their wingspan. One angel has wings to cover that distance, and their wings touch. It says, verse 24, the wingspan of each of the cherubim was 15 feet, each wing being 7.5 feet long. The 2 cherubim were identical in shape and size. Each was 15 feet tall. Solomon placed them side by side in the inner sanctuary of the temple. Now listen, their outstretched wings reached from wall to wall. What's the size of the room? What's the wingspan? Yeah, two angels side by side, 30 feet, 15 and 15. So the one tip touches the wall, the other tip touches the tip of the other angel, and then the other wing touches the next wall. So it's solid. Their outspread wings reached from wall to wall, while their inner wings touched at the center of the room. He overlaid the 2 cherubim with gold, so they're solid gold as well. There's another picture of what they could have looked like with the Ark of the Covenant in between. Verse 29, all the walls of the inner sanctuary in the main room are decorated with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The floors in both rooms were overlaid with gold. The floors were overlaid with gold. So, you walk in there, it's just what you see there. It's not just, and gold shines. Man, polished gold shines. And so there you have the side walls. It said that they're decorated with cherubim, with angels, and with palm trees, and with open flowers. So that gives you a little idea what that could have looked like. And then verse 31, it says, for the entrance to the inner sanctuary, Solomon made double doors of olive wood with 5-sided doorposts. I don't know what that means. These doors were decorated with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and the doors were overlaid with gold. So here we see a door there. Do you see that's a folding door? Do you see that door, that cutaway? See the big pillar? Right next to it, you see there's a folding door, and they were folding. We're going to see that in a moment. So that's the veil. There you have the pictures of the cherubim, the angels, and the palm trees on the side of the temple. And then we're talking about the door. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, Solomon made double doors of olive wood with 5-sided doorposts. Verse 33, here are folding doors. Then he made 4-sided doorposts of olive wood for the entrance to the temple. There were 2 folding doors of cypress wood, and each was hinged to fold back upon itself. These doors were decorated with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and the doors were overlaid with gold. So again, if you picture one big door or 2 big doors going into the temple, that wasn't it. They were bifold doors like you might have in your closets at home, right? That's how they operated, hinged in the middle. Yeah. And then it says, verse 36, the walls of the inner courtyard were built so that there was, listen, 1 layer of cedar beams after 3 layers of hewn stones. And I had a good picture of this when I taught in this some time ago. This is not a good picture. But they did this because of earthquakes. I mean, this was in God's design, but they said that by putting cedar in between the rock, if there was an earthquake, it helped absorb. It wasn't as rigid a wall with the wood in between. So again, listen to what it says. The walls of the inner courtyard were built so that there was 1 layer of cedar beams after 3 layers of hewn stones. And then it says, the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid in mid-spring in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. The entire building was completed in every detail by mid-autumn in the 11th year of his reign. It took 7 years to build the temple. Now, let me just get the right pictures here. So these are Solomon's quarries. Let me get to the location. This is located, I think, it's near one of the gates. That wall that you see up above is the wall today that surrounds Jerusalem. And this is at the base of the wall. And that doorway there is where you go in. And when you go in, this is where you enter. These are Solomon's quarries. This is where they believe the stone was quarried from and carried out. So they didn't have to carry it a great distance. The distance from these quarries to the temple, I'm guessing maybe 1,000, 1,200 feet. That's a very rough guess, maybe. There again is going back into, so they would have moved them along that area. And there's the sign, Solomon's quarries or Zedekiah's temple. So it took 7 years to build, and you saw the quarries now. Now let's go into, after the temple, Solomon now builds his own place. Solomon also built a temple for himself, and it took 13 years to complete the construction. 7 for the temple, 13 for his home. You know why it took him 13 years instead of 7? He had to keep adding bathrooms. He had 1,000 wives, right? He had to keep adding bathrooms. You know that's true. Verse 2. It says, one of Solomon's buildings was called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. This is his home. The great cedar beams rested on 4 rows of cedar pillars. It had a cedar roof supported by 45 rafters that rested on 3 rows of pillars, 15 on each row. On each of the side walls, there were 3 rows of windows facing each other, and all the doorways were rectangular in frame, and they were in sets of 3 facing each other. So this is what that may look like, all those pillars. And you can see there Solomon's throne, and we're going to be talking about that throne in a little bit. So that would be Solomon's palace. Another picture of his palace, the pillars that they were talking about, the steps up his throne, and the throne room. And in case you're interested, just this one building, there are a whole bunch of buildings as a part of his compound. This one building is 150 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet high. The temple was 90 feet by 30 feet by 45 feet high. The square footage of the temple was 2,700 square feet. The square footage of his house was 11,250 square feet. So the temple is 2,700. His home is 11,000 square feet. It could help explain why it took almost twice as long to build his place. So going on to verse 6, he also built the hall of pillars, which is 75 feet long, 45 feet wide. There was a porch on his front covered by a canopy that was supported by pillars. Now, what we wanted to show you here is this is what they think this whole compound looked like. So you can see the temple. This would have been based on excavations, I guess, what they have come up with. The temple's on the right side. I'm not sure where they got that tall, chimney-like looking addition. I've never seen that before. But the rest of it looks about right. But then they have his throne, the porch of the throne, the porch of the pillars, the house of the forest of Lebanon, and all of his buildings. So I mean, it was enormous. But right off of the palace, right off of the palace. And then let's see, 7. Verse 7. There was also the hall of the throne, also known as the hall of judgment, where Solomon sat to hear legal matters. It was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling. And again, the throne room, they're different. As you're going to hear in a moment when we read about the throne room, it's a detailed description of what the throne room looks like. There's one picture what the throne room might have looked like. Another picture what the throne room might have looked like. Another picture of what the throne room might have looked like. And we'll get to that in a moment. You know what? Let me read that now. I tried to find this but could not. If some of you are able to locate this and you can get it to me, I'd appreciate it. But I read that, the Jews celebrate Purim every year, which was when the Jews defeated Haman and those that came against them. And probably, if you've read the book of Esther, and the story of the life of the Jews, there are not very many rousing victories that the Jews have had against political enemies through the eons. It's rare. I mean, Moses in Egypt, of course, they celebrate that, but there were not many rousing successes. But the one against Haman was huge, and they celebrate that every year. And but what I was told, if you can find this, I wasn't able to. I was told that every year in synagogue, they read this account of Solomon's throne. Now, I don't know why, but they read this account. So as you picture Solomon on his throne, is that a clear picture? Is there a clear one? That's pretty clear. So listen to this. Solomon's throne is described at length in the Targum, Sheni IC, and in the 2 later midrashes published by Jelnik. The second, then they give their sources. According to the Targum, which is compiled from 3 different sources, there were on the steps of the throne 12 golden lions and 12 golden eagles, so placed that each lion faced an eagle. Another account says that there were 72 lions and the same number of eagles. Further, it is stated that there were 6 steps to the throne on which animals, all gold, were arranged in the following order. Now let me get one of these other pictures here. Animals were arranged in the following order. On the first step, a lion opposite an ox. On the second, a wolf opposite a sheep. On the third, a tiger opposite a camel. On the fourth, an eagle opposite a peacock. On the fifth, a cat opposite a cock. On the sixth, a hawk opposite a dove. On the top of the throne was a dove holding a sparrowhawk in its claws, symbolizing the dominion of Israel over the Gentiles. There was also on top of the throne a golden candlestick on the 7 branches of the one side of which were engraved the names of the 7 patriarchs, Adam, Noah, Shem, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Job. And on the 7 of the other were the names of Levi, Kohath, Abraham, Moses, Aaron, Eliad, Medad, and in addition Hur. Above the candlesticks was a golden jar filled with olive oil, and beneath it a golden basin which supplied the jar with oil, on which the names of Nadab, Abihu, and Elihu and his 2 sons were engraved. Over the throne, 24 vines were fixed to cast a shadow on the king's head. By a mechanical contrivance, the throne followed Solomon wherever he wished to go. Mechanically, it would follow him as he walked around. The description given in 2 midrashes described differs somewhat from the foregoing. Referring to the words, then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord, the second midrash remarks that Solomon's throne was like that of God, was furnished with the 4 figurines representing a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, with cherubim and wheels. Let me skip. It says the mechanism of the throne. This is interesting. Solomon's progress to his throne is similarly described in the Targum and in 2 midrashes. According to the former work, listen, when the king reached the first step, when he touched that first step, this happened mechanically. When he touched the first step, the ox, by means of some sort of mechanism, stretched forth its leg on which Solomon leaned. A similar action taking place in the case of each of the animals on each of the 6 steps. In other words, when he stepped on the step, it mechanically would stick out an arm or an appendage that he could hold onto it. When he go away from that step, the appendage would go back down. All mechanical. From the 6th step, the eagles raised the king and placed him in his seat. Near the golden serpent lay coiled. When the king was seated, the large eagle placed the crown on his head mechanically. The serpent uncoiled itself mechanically, and the lions and the eagles moved forward to form a shade over him. The dove then descended mechanically, took the scroll of the law from the ark, and placed it on Solomon's knees. When the king sat surrounded by the Sanhedrin to judge, the wheels began to turn, and the beasts and the fowls began to utter their respective cries, which frightened those who had intended to bear false testimony. Moreover, while Solomon was ascending the throne, the lions scattered all kinds of fragrant spices. In the 2nd midrash, it says, quote, when Solomon wished to sit on the throne, the ox took him gently on its horns and handed him over to the lion, which in turn delivered him over to the sheep, and so on until the seat was reached. 6 steps were also studded with precious stones and with crystal, and there were besides arches from which palm trees rose over the throne to make a shadow for the king's head. Both the midrash state that when Solomon was seated, a silver serpent turned a wheel mechanically, which caused the eagles to spread their wings over the king's heads. Then one lion placed the crown on his head, while another placed the golden scepter in his hand. It is explained that the first midrash that 6 steps were constructed because Solomon foresaw that 6 kings would sit on the throne, namely Solomon, Rehoboam, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amnon, and Josiah. After Solomon's death, King Shishak, when taking away the treasure from the temple, when they robbed the temple, this is what it says. When they ransacked the temple and the king took the throne, this king carried the throne off into Egypt until Sennacherib conquered that country. After Sennacherib's fall and Hezekiah gained possession of it, when Josiah was slain by Pharaoh, Necho took the ladder away, but not knowing the proper use of it, he was struck by one of the lions and became lame. Nebuchadnezzar, into whose possession the throne came, shared a similar fate. The throne then passed to the Persians, with whom it has remained until it came into the possessions of Ahasuerus, who, however, could not sit upon it either. They were all injured by sitting on the throne. It was booby-trapped to kind of wallop them. So there's a lot of tradition on Solomon's throne. Again, there are just some possible pictures. It was quite a throne. So let's go on. That was verse 7. Let's go to 8. Solomon's living quarters surrounded a courtyard behind this hall. They were built the same way. He also built similar living quarters for Pharaoh's daughter, one of his wives. All these buildings were built entirely from huge, costly blocks of stone, cut and trimmed to exact measure on all sides. Some of the huge foundation stones were 15 feet long. Some were 12 feet long. A costly block of stone used in the walls were also cut to measure, and cedar beams were also used. The walls of the great courtyard were built so that there was one layer of cedar beams after 3 layers of hewn stone, just like the walls of the inner courtyard of the Lord's temple with its entrance foyer. So, and then let's, verse 13. This next section is we're going to talk about these. King Solomon then asked for a man named Purim to come from Tyre, for he was a craftsman skilled in bronze work. He was half Israelite, since his mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father had been a foundry worker from Tyre, so he came to work for King Solomon. Hiram cast 2 bronze pillars, each 27 feet tall and 18 feet in circumference. That gives you an idea. 27 feet tall, 18 feet in circumference. For the tops of the pillars, he made capitals of molten bronze, each 7.5 feet tall, just the tops. Each capital was decorated with 7 sets of lattice work and interwoven with chains. He also made 2 rows of pomegranates. You can see those at the bottom there, to decorate the capitals over the pillars. The capitals on the columns inside the foyer were shaped like lilies. They were 6 feet tall. Each capital had 2 pillars, had 200 pomegranates in rows around them, beside the rounded surface next to the lattice work. Go down to verse 20, second part of verse 21. It says, he named the one on the south Jachin, and the one on the north Boaz, and these were the 2 pillars. Huge, all bronze. There it gives the names Jachin and Boaz, and there you can see the location of them outside the palace doors. I'm sorry I didn't look up what those names mean. I did it one time, but I don't remember that. I apologize. In verse 23, and then Hiram cast a large round tank, 15 feet across from rim to rim. It was called the Sea. It was 7.5 feet deep. This is a swimming pool. And about 45 feet in circumference. The sea was encircled just below its rim by 2 rows of decorative gourds. There were about 6 gourds per foot all the way around, and they had been cast as part of the tank. The sea rested on a base of 12 bronze oxen, all facing outward. 3 faced north, 3 faced south, 3 faced west, 3 faced east. The walls of the sea were about 3 inches thick. Imagine what that weighed, 3 inches thick. And its rim flared out like a cup and resembled a lily blossom. It could hold about 11,000 gallons of water. So, so that's what that looked like. Hiram also made, see those carts there? He also, there's another picture, what it could have looked like. 3 north, east, southwest. Then there were these water carts. I like these water carts. Those are pretty cool looking. Here's a description, and it's in verse 23. Then Hiram cast large round tank, 15 feet across, from rim to rim. It was called, go down to, verse 27. Hiram also made 10 bronze water carts, each 6 feet long, 6 feet wide, 4.5 feet high. They were constructed with side panels braced with crossbars. Each of the panels with the end crossbars were decorated with carved lions, oxen, and cherubim, angels. Above and below the lions and ox were wreath decorations. Each of the carts had 4 bronze wheels and bronze axles. At each corner of the carts, they were supported in posts for the bronze basins. These supports were decorated with carvings of wreaths on each side. On the top of each cart, it had a circular frame for the basin. It projected 1.5 feet above the cart's top, like a round pedestal. You can see that. And its opening was 2.5 feet across. Verse 32, under the panels were 4 wheels that were connected to axles that had been cast as one unit with the cart. The wheels were 2.5 feet in diameter and were similar to chariot wheels. The axle, spokes, rims, and hubs were all cast from molten bronze. Verse 34, there were supports at each of the 4 corners of the carts, and these 2 were cast as one unit with the cart. Around the top of each cart there was a rim 9 inches wide. You can see the rim there, 9 inches wide. The supports and side panels were cast as one unit. Carvings of cherubim, lions, and palm trees decorated the panels and supported wherever there was room. And there were wreaths all around. All 10 water carts were the same size and were made alike, for each was cast from the same mold. So you get a picture there. Then let's go into verse 38. Purim also made 10 bronze basins for each cart. Each basin was 6 feet across and could hold 220 gallons of water. That's the water tank there. He arranged 5 water carts, and then it goes on. 41, it talks about the decorations around it. 42, verse 42, it talks about 400 pomegranates hanging from the chains. And then it says in verse 45, all the utensils for the temple of the Lord that Purim made for Solomon were made of burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the Jordan Valley. Solomon did not weigh all the utensils because there were so many, the weight of the bronze could not be measured. So Solomon made up all the furnishings of the temple of the Lord. The gold altar, the gold table of presence, the gold lampstands. Verse 50, the cups, lamp snuffers, basins, dishes, fire pans, all of pure gold. The doors to the entrance of the most holy place in the main room of the temple with the fronts overlaid with gold. So King Solomon finished all his work on the temple of the Lord. Then Solomon brought all the gifts his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the other utensils, and stored them in the treasuries of the temple. So that is Solomon's temple. I knew I'd show you a lot of pictures. I hope that the pictures would help overwhelm the boredom of the item. But we do go through the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And so you just had the chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Any thoughts on any of this? Anything kind of come to mind as we talked about this? Observations?
I think Herod's temple was 150 feet high. That's 50 stories.
Wow, that's high. That's high. Yeah, Herod's temple was an amazing structure. Yeah. Yes, Carrie? Oh, okay. There was one over here. Yes, Jason.
What fascinates me is all the mechanisms when Solomon would go up the temple steps.
Yeah. Yeah, you think about how you'd have to counterbalance all of that. You know what I mean? Because anything that has weight to it, you have to counterbalance somewhere with a weight, and that would have been an incredible structure underneath. Wayne.
When you showed the
Yes.
and the gold, that one picture that had the gold,
Like this? This one? This one? Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. The streets of gold. Is that what you said, right? Someday. I almost hate to tell you the story because I know so many of you heard this before, but the story is told of a guy that he was told that you can't take anything to heaven. And he said, I'm going to take something. I'm going to convert all my wealth into gold, and I'm going to sneak it with me into heaven. And he hid it behind himself. He's at the gate. St. Peter misses it, and he carries the gold in. And the angel saw him, kind of caught the glimpse of the package of gold behind his back, and he said to St. Peter, he said, St. Peter, didn't you see the gold? St. Peter said, yeah. And the angel said, why would a guy carry blacktop into heaven? Right? Streets of gold. I thought that was kind of cute. Other thoughts on any of this? I want to close by telling you two really cool things about the temple after Jesus was crucified. So Jesus was crucified right around 33 AD. There's a lot of talk about that, but most 33, 34 AD. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. All right? Now, what's interesting is that there are three things that happened. One doesn't have to do with the temple. The other two do. And in the Talmud, and the Talmud was comprised, now listen to this, the Talmud are Jewish writings that were compiled 200 AD to 600 AD. So it was begun 130 years after the destruction of the temple. You with me? After the destruction of the temple, they started compiling this. They finished it 600 AD, the Talmud. Now, the Jewish writers obviously are not, during that time especially, are not trying to give any credibility to Christianity, right? They would want to discredit Christianity any place they could. And yet in the Talmud, which again was only started 200 AD, the Talmud says that the scapegoat, once a year, Day of Atonement, they take a scapegoat and they put the sins of the people on the goat and they send it out into the wilderness. And it was supposed to stay out there. Well, as you know, as history went on, the rabbis became terrified that the goat would come back into the city and bring the sins back in. So they take it to a hill called Azel, and they throw it over the hill. Now, so it would die. Now, and it was a real long process. One rabbi would run so long with the goat, then another rabbi, till they got to this hill. But before they take the goat out of the temple, they would put a red string around its neck. A red string. And the Talmud says that when there was a particularly righteous high priest that year, that cord would turn white. When the goat was dead, they would go down and examine it, and they would find that the red string had turned white, which indicated, they took it to mean, that the sins of the people had been forgiven. They'd been forgiven. And in the rabbinic teachings, it says that about half the time it turned white. About half the time. That's what it said. But what it says in the Talmud, again comprised 200 AD, it says that about 40 years after the destruction of the temple, when was 40 years before the destruction of the temple? When was 40 years before the destruction of the temple? 30 AD, Jesus. It says that about 40 years before the destruction of the temple, from that time on, the temple, until the destruction of the temple, the red cord never turned white once. Do you see why? The system was done. There was no forgiveness through that. that old system went away, and now Jesus replaced it. The other thing, two other things that happened. These are really cool. Those lamps were supposed to be kept lit all the time. And the Talmud says, I think it was like 40,000 days. Again, it says from around 40 years before the destruction of the temple, every night the lamps would go out. They were commanded to keep those lights lit every night. They couldn't keep them lit. They'd come in the morning and they were out. What does oil represent? Holy Spirit. The Spirit was gone. Another thing that happened is the veil was rent in two, right? Right? Well, after that, I'm sure they fixed that baby up. You know, some say that veil was between 6 and 18 inches thick. Finely woven. They said that 70 virgin women wove that thing. And it took 100 men, I think it said 100 men to lift it, to get it up into place. But I don't know if they sewed a new one or they fixed it, but it was back in place. But the Talmud says that periodically, I don't remember the frequency, but again, from 40 years before until the destruction of the temple, when they would come in the morning, the back doors to the Holy of Holies, which were side doors, were open. And they said there were monstrous doors. It would take a multitude of men to open the doors, but those doors would be open. And again, I think God trying to open the Holy of Holies to the presence of men. All this is in Jewish writings. And you think they wouldn't want them in there, right? Because you figure out 40 years before is about Jesus. And so there is so much history surrounding. One of the things on Solomon, they said, was Solomon kind of figured out that someday the temple was going to be ransacked. And so he had a device made, again, legend, a mechanical device that when that happened, that the Ark of the Covenant would drop down through the floor and be protected underneath. I don't believe that's true, but that's what they say. Now the Jews teach that Jeremiah carried the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem, across the Jordan River, and into the mountains on the other side. And that's why when they said to Jesus, Jesus said, Peter, who do men say that I am? Some say John the Baptist, some say Jeremiah. Some say some other prophet. Why Jeremiah? Well, the reason Jeremiah is because the Jewish rabbis taught that before the Messiah came, Jeremiah was going to come back, get the ark out of that cave on the other side of the Jordan and bring it back into Jerusalem. And so he was almost a forerunner, almost like a John the Baptist, because they believed that Jeremiah would have to come before him and bring the Ark of the Covenant back. So there's so much interesting things about this temple. Under the Temple Mount today, in 1967, when Israel took Jerusalem and regained it, they made an agreement, they made a concession. They didn't really want to do this, but they tried to be nice guys. And so they put the control of the Temple Mount in the hands of the Jordanians. So they oversee the Temple Mount. And because of that, no one is really allowed to go down and excavate under the Temple Mount. Now, they're doing some in there. I don't know how all that works. When we go over, you can see them digging out in certain areas. But it's a huge, huge area, like 33 football fields. 33 football fields. And that whole thing is built on pillars and arches. At some areas, the height is so great, there are 3 tiers of pillars, arches, pillars, arches, pillars, arches. 33 football fields, open, that hasn't been discovered. Now think of what could be under there, right? So it's a fascinating place. So, you all templed out? We're out of time, but we're not out of Bible. Let's close. Father, thank you for this time in your word. And Father, I thank you that we all will see Ezekiel's temple. We'll all be in Ezekiel's temple. We will see the Lord Jesus Christ on his throne in the temple. And Father, we look forward to that day. And it may not be that far away. It may not be that far away. The rapture, then 7 years of tribulation, and then Jesus comes back to the Mount of Olives. And we come with him. Father, thank you. Thank you. It would be so, well, yeah, it would be wonderful if we were that generation. But Father, even so, come, Lord Jesus, come. We love you. We praise you. And we ask all this in Christ's name. And all of God's people said, amen. Hey, thanks for coming out tonight. If you can stay for prayer, the men will meet over here, the women back there. God bless you all.